a transformation of language into something which is no longer sound decoded by brain through the consultation of a culturally validated dictionary, but instead it becomes sound which is beheld. So, as I said at the beginning, there's no conclusion about all of this stuff. It is the frontier. There is a very large frontier. We're very fond of the notion of an ever-expanding sphere of understanding. But has anyone stopped to notice that if you have an ever-expanding sphere of understanding, necessarily the surface volume of the frontier of the unknown becomes larger and larger? So, it's like building a bonfire bigger and bigger to convince yourself that there's an awful lot of darkness. So I think, the key to getting around the cultural momentum that has placed us in this position is to return to the Baconian method, which is simply the collection of facts and the examination of them until patterns emerge, and that then the major datum for thinking about the psychedelic experience, it should be the experience. And that the pharmacology and all of these things, they will elucidate operational details of how these things function at the wetware level, but they will never elucidate the component which is beheld by the experient in confrontation with the drug. In fact, it's silly to demand that of them, because that's not the kind of information that they are able to deliver. In fact, no system of thought is able to deliver that kind of a description. That has to come from the individual. And that's why I am fond of speaking of these things as deconditioning agents, because what they show you is that, each man, each woman, their own Magellan. You need no longer participate in a pyramid of information where it's filtering down to you from the scientific, medical, governmental, and military elite, being explained by CBS, NBC, and Newsweek, and Time. You can discover, actually, that the adventure of being is not a cultural adventure, it's not a societal adventure, it's a personal adventure. And that this is what you really need to be involved in. And all this is happening. This is why shamanism has gained such a hold, because it's a metaphor for personal responsibility. And I think we all take personal responsibility for the evolution of our worldviews. Psychedelic people, I'm referring to, take responsibility for the evolution of their worldviews. But still, we operate under the shadow of what's right to say about it and what's not right to say about it. And so I want to describe a typical encounter with this phenomenon, because a client has had this experience over a dozen times, and it's almost always unvarying. The problem is the client happens to be myself. So getting independent confirmation that this could happen to someone else has not been very easy. Nevertheless, I operate under the faith that there's nothing unique about me, and that anything I could experience is a generally accessible human phenomenon. I mean, I think it would be preposterous to operate under any other kind of assumption. In giving DMT to people casually over a number of years, only 4 people have reported the kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in. And of course, every single one of them had been primed by me. Nevertheless, the experience is of such an ontologically different modality that it's difficult to see how you could cue it to somebody. They would have to have it. And what it involves is a transformation of language into something which is no longer sound decoded by brain through the consultation of a culturally validated dictionary, but instead it becomes sound which is beheld and meaning which is beheld. And this idea of a visible language, when it first came to me, or when I first realized that that was the phrase I was going to have to use to describe what was happening, I had never heard or imagined of such a thing. But then I went back into the literature and I discovered that, as usual, the Greeks got there first, or at least in this case, the Jewish Greeks, or the Greek Jews, because in Philo-Judaeus, who was a contemporary of Christ, there's a discussion of what he calls the more perfect logos. And he says the more perfect logos will be apprehended through seeing, not through hearing. And yet it will cross from being heard to being seen without ever going through a noticeable moment when it shifts from one modality to the other. And this seems to be what is happening in the DMT flash when you smoke the freebase, not the hydrochloride, but when you smoke the freebase, you have this spontaneous experience of generating what you identify first as a thought and then as a sound, but which eventually becomes some kind of synesthesic linguistic modality for which we don't have words yet. Telepathy I always conceived of as looking into your own mind and hearing what someone else was thinking. But the notion that telepathy might be someone speaking and producing a three-dimensional object in the air that could be rotated and mutually beheld by the speaker and the listener had never occurred to me. But experiment with the DMT showed that this extraordinary kind of state is actually potentially triggerable again and again. And it is, it's almost as though there is a sensorium of the world, which in order to be reconstructed in the interior horizon of transcendence that is the being of a given individual, the sensorium has to be arbitrarily broken down into its perceptual components of sound, sight, odor, tactility, etc. And normally, as it enters the human organism, these categories, which are arbitrary but as old as the human body itself, are maintained. But they need not necessarily be maintained. The incoming sensory data can be recombined in such a way that no trace of the portal of entry is left upon it. And in that case, you get this freely evolving topology of light and sound that is translinguistic. It has a grammar of form, if you will, so that it is not shorn of meaning. It is simply shorn of the kind of particularized meaning that logical necessity imposes on language. Instead, it has an emotional richness, a kind of poetic depth that is not like ordinary language at all, and in fact causes one to think of discussions of primary poetic languages, such as the one that goes on in The White Goddess by Robert Graves, where he wants to suggest that there is a proto-language, an Ursprach, that transcends conventionalized dictionaries, a language which to hear it is to understand it. And I think that this kind of organization of information lies at the basis of the psychedelic experience. In other words, you can think of cultural conventions and human languages as software languages that are historical adumbrations of an assembly language which is prehistoric and probably in the genes and antedates all notion of human conventionalizing of activity and is actually biologically the basis of language. As I said in the opening remarks, that if you want to see the thumbprint of God in the world, it seems to me the phenomenon of human language is where you look. I mean, human language is a psychic ability. I can make thoughts in your head by simply uttering certain small mouth noises. And the degree of fineness of the images that I can produce in your head and you in mine through the use of small mouth noises is something which we're still exploring. I think that, it's well known that the human animal has not appreciably evolved in 50 or 60,000 years, possibly much longer. Once culture was established, the soma of the human species was relatively stabilized. Then change was no longer genetic. It became epigenetic. And you get, just as the stability sets in the animal form, you begin to get this fantastic proliferation of epigenetic change in the form of the evolution of culture, languages, alphabets. It all seems to be related somehow to the encoding of information. And the psychedelic state also seems to be about the revelation of kinds of information which are normally either not efficacious or unavailable for other reasons. And it is not that culture is evolving. The evolution of culture is an epiphenomenon attendant upon the evolution of language. Language is the part of man which is evolving. Culture carries along. At the present moment, we are able to speak 21st century ideas to each other, but our culture is carrying along at about the 1950s level. Nevertheless, it seems to me that this thing which psilocybin does to the language-producing part of the brain is not then some mere affect, some trivial affect of an obscure hallucinogen on a peripheral part of the brain. It means that it is, in fact, a catalyst for evolution, because it is a catalyst for the evolution of language. We are not going to move into the future until we create that future through language. And the hardest thing to cause to change is language. It has an immense inertia because it is so unself-reflective of itself. And this is what we need to inject into it, is an element of self-reflection so that the evolution of language can become more conscious and less random. Because it's the non-randomizing of the evolution of language that will give us a real hold on the kinds of social modalities that we want to produce in the future. Now, I don't know if the tryptamine-induced glossolalia will have a major role to play in that. It may be simply one of the many promising scintillas or sparks thrown off by the psychedelic experience that invites exploration. But certainly all of these things, the chanting, the glossolalia, the inner discourses with alien forces, the self-examination of one's own motives, all of these things are linguistic activities and go on in the context of linguistic action. It seems to me that what these drugs synergize is cognitive activities of all sorts. This is why originally they were called consciousness-expanding drugs. And this synergy of cognitive activity has to be taken very, very seriously, because it's having a massive effect on our society. For instance, the UFO thing is a cultural taboo and not believed in by intellectually nice people. It's more the province of telephone line repairmen and that sort of slice. But the fact of the matter is that no matter how much it may discomfort drug researchers and UFO people, because each is struggling to gain respectability in an inherently dubious field, but actually, I think there would be a fertile advance made if these two groups could talk to each other. Some people hearing me say that must wonder what in the world I'm talking about. How can a problem of of unidentified aircraft be related to the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience. But you see, it isn't so much a problem of unidentified aircraft, it's a problem of not recognizing that the entire spectrum of existence is embedded in a linguistic model that is created by the workings of minds, and that mind is an imponderable, and yet it's set at the beginning of the equation. Jung very early suggested in a book called Flying Saucers, a myth, a modern myth of things seen in the sky that he published in 1948, that it was in fact a projection of the mass psyche, that it was assimilable to the goals of alchemical transubstantiation. He called it the rotunda, the scintilla, the spark, the spinning thing. And it's all these things, but it is the clue that we are somehow trapped inside some kind of artifice, that the world that we're inside of is much more like a work of art than it is like the smooth-running mechanistic machine that Newtonian science describes. That description works very well for all low-grade phenomena, up to about the level of the weather. But from there on, the notion that the world is simply, probabilistic processes following these various creodes of least resistance becomes very untenable, because each of us, in our experience of being, lives in a highly theatrical world. And what I mean by that is that you can see a woman at a great distance from you, in class, in opportunity, all of these things, and you fall in love with this woman, and it's hopeless. But of course, as we all know, it's also inevitable. And that inevitability totally violates physics, because it really is hopeless. How is it then that each of our lives is a work of art, of unbelievable chance encounters, coincidences, and wishes projected onto the world but never spoken and strangely fulfilled in the oddest ways? I think that it's because the world is made of language, and that if the Eastern conception that the universe is mind has any operational impact in the world, it will be through conceiving of mind as the underlying, self-aware, self-active, world-forming grammar of being. So that what Freud called the superego, what I call the overmind, there have been different ways of talking about it, has to be seen not as a passive homeostatic controlling device, but actually as the most intelligent organization on this planet. And we are all only components of this, believing ourselves to be the highest expression of freedom. But it is actually at the species level that organization is controlled, and that's why the emergence of ideas like the calculus or the invention of LSD or the steam engine, why these things have this curious property of being regulated from above. It's because the world is not nearly as chaotic and random as we suppose. We are actually trapped inside a giant organism. Jung, the word synchronicity was coined by Jung, and it means a meaningful coincidence. But I think it was P.D. Bridgman who said that a coincidence is what you have left over when you apply a bad theory. And there can be just so many of these meaningful coincidences before somebody has to stand up and say, hell, this can't be coincidences, meaningful or otherwise. Something else is happening here. Anyway, I noticed that Sasha, when he described the phenomenology of psilocybin, didn't say a thing about self-transforming elf machines or whispered messages from gods and demons. So you're free to believe that this is the raving of an unhinged mind, but, being a Jeremiah figure is a great tradition, and they usually have the last laugh. Are there any questions?
That's the story.
Please.
Sort of psilocybin glossolalia that's not any words that are in any cultures right now, but that has meaning for you.
Yes.
Have you ever heard of, or have you yourself communicated with another person in this language?
You mean while I was loaded and they were loaded?
Yeah.
Yes.
And both of you have had this experience of shared meaning?
Yes, but see, how can we check since English won't flow back and forth?
No, I take your word, if you both experienced shared meaning and confirmed it, that's about as far as you could go, I guess.
I think so. But when I listen to recordings of this glossolalia down, it makes me very uncomfortable, and I wonder what could possibly be the matter with me that I place so much emphasis on this. And I've noticed, it'll clear most rooms in a hurry. I mean, it's all, people are with it, and they say, oh, it's far out, and all this stuff. And then you play it, and they say, well, I've got to go do something. They draw back. It seems too quirky.
So it's like you do some and they do some, back and forth, except it's totally unintelligible to the English ear.
Yeah, it's totally unintelligible to the English ear. What it sounds like when I listen to it down is it sounds like a language, a human language, very, very far removed from English.
Well, what you're talking about really could be the language before we tried to build the Tower of Babel. We all shared the same language, then it got split up because we were
the Ursprach.
Or something.
This is the term for that. Ursprach, the first language. Yes, it may. That's what I mean by an assembly language. But the things that happen on psychedelics with language just defy rational apprehension. I mean, for instance, there's a Celtic saying that poetry is made at the edge of running water. And I've noticed on psilocybin at times that as you approach running water, like a river or a waterfall, you begin to think in rhyme. It's sprung verse. And it seems preposterous, and you say, this is too crazy to mention to anyone, and you're right. But nevertheless, it's happening, I mean, and as you leave the river, thought becomes perfectly normal. And and people say, well, white noise is doing this. That's an explanation. Or you look at historical phenomena. Muhammad, it turns out, spoke in verse. And it was considered a sign of election. Glossolalia with shaman is not that rare. Spirit voices.
It happens without drugs all the time.
Yes, although I don't know if you know this book by Sylvia Goodman called Speaking in Tongues, which is, as far as I know, the major work in English. It's done strictly from the sociological approach, but there is some physiological data. The most interesting being that on the floor of these Costa Rican churches where she did her research, after these sessions, they would measure pools of saliva 18 inches across, deposited by single individuals. Also, what was going on was there was a lot of hyped up, hallelujah type stuff, and then someone would fall into the glossolalia and utter a burst of it, and then be almost like a post-epileptic situation, and they would turn to the people around them and say, did I do it? Did I really speak in tongues? This is not what the DMT glossolalia is like. What it is, and I'll take a minute and describe it because...
You have a recording?
Not with me. But I'll describe how it comes, because I think people often say to me, well, I took mushrooms and nothing like that ever happened. Well, the first time it happened to me was the first time I smoked DMT. And I'm not sure that it would happen on psilocybin if you didn't have a lead into it. You have to invoke it. In other words, it isn't that psilocybin causes it, and this is interesting. It's that psilocybin carries you to a place where it is possible given several other things which seem to be necessary. So psilocybin is necessary but not sufficient for this phenomenon. What else is required is a thing which is sort of hard to describe, but it's an attitude of expectation. It's an attitude of being on the verge of communication even though nobody else is present. In other words, you have to invoke it. And that word, strangely enough, has a history related to demonic summoning and that sort of thing. But that's what you do. You invoke it. You feel the load of the psilocybin and you say, aha, it's enough now. And then you you try it, and you do this by consciously speaking gibberish. In other words, what seems to be happening is that you have to release your brain's expectation that sound will have meaning. Because when we all speak, the words have a meaning attached to them, or else there's something wrong with you. But if you will speak gibberish for a moment, just for a moment, it's like priming the pump. And the break then is made with whatever connects language to meaning, and language begins to flower and to take off and to develop these abstract modalities that are free of association, but that are obviously highly ordered and grammatical and going through complicated, it's like a sonata. And in fact, it's led me to suggest that probably language existed thousands and thousands of years before meaning. That this is what monkeys, these evolving monkeys on the brink of self-reflection, did for each other as a form of entertainment. It's not as much of an energy drain as chanting and singing. You just carry it on at a conversational level, but it's word music that very, very fine nuances of the stuff it's manipulating, which is not meaning, but whatever it is, this topological manifold, very fine nuances can be imparted to it by these small mouth noises.
And is it anything like what babies who are about to learn to speak do? They carry on these things, and it sounds like a language that you just don't understand. There's all this inflection, and it sounds very intelligent if you could just kind of catch it.
It's like that.
It is very close to actual language.
It's like that, only more so.
Only more complex.
Like one of the things that seems to be going on is there seems to be more phonemes than are actually in any human language. I mean, isn't it that there are 52 phonemes and no language known has more than 41 or something like that? But because if you do this for a while, and it's so much fun, it's a kind of ecstasy to do it, that there's no reason to stop if you're alone. After you've done it for an hour or so, your face, your mouth, is just hanging down to your waist. I mean, it's like you've just done something to the whole front of your head, and all the musculature has dissolved because you've been making all these sounds that you never make. And the whole front of your face feels different. So every language has a set of coded mouth positions which are expected and easily facilitated through use.
It's easier if there's somebody else there to hear it.
No, there's rarely somebody there to hear it when I do it.
Well,
I sometimes wish.
Is it easier? In other words, because I got the impression that there was something about the attention, the listening of somebody else that facilitated the channeling through.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, for instance, I'm very shy about it. I feel like it's a very personal thing to do, so that it's hard for me to do it in the presence of other people. But this is just perhaps my personality or my association with it.
I think you're a better speaker in English since having these experiences.
Yes, well, this is
There's
something.
more fluidity that there are, you have developed, your face and your expression. And
Well, here's what I think it is. And Henry Munn made this point in his article. And I said earlier, that what we need is the evolution of language, and it's all about the evolution of language. Yes, it's a continuum. And as I guess it was here or it was somewhere recently, I said, it begins as clear thought. It moves into eloquence. it then becomes charismatic. At that point, if it goes any further, it will be called demonic possession, because it's happening too much. You're not supposed to be that compelling. You're not supposed to be that powerful a speaker. And if you stick with it past demonic possession, it becomes these objects. It actually crosses over and becomes the topological modality that I mentioned. Jill and I were talking in the baths the other night because she made her sounds down there, and I caught it at a certain angle visually, and I could see these things coming out of her mouth, which looked like blue smoke. And I've seen this before. It looks like heat waves off a highway, and perhaps it's nothing more than heated air that's been in the lungs, heated by the body, has a different refractive index than the exterior air. It's probably expelled in a series of waves, and so if you have the light just right, what you see is a displacement of light, a flickering in the vicinity of the mouth. But I think I've also, in a stone state, watched that condense into this more visible language, and it's as though, there are finer and finer levels of vibration. The whole notion of the word becoming flesh, which occurs in cosmogonic myths as diverse as the Judeo-Christian and the Australian Aborigine. It's always about a word. A word was uttered, and this word was somehow more than a word. It adumbrated through dimensions and caused the phenomenon of being. And this is the sort of thing that's happening. But to answer your question, yes, I think that I have verbal facility because I've taken so much of this drug. And maybe I had a tendency toward it at the beginning, being Irish and not given to hard work. But nevertheless, it definitely does this, and it does it temporarily. Like when you take psilocybin, if you actually try to do what we call raving, which is, a high-speed soliloquy, but the raving can just go anywhere. And if it's true that what we are creatures of information, then this is very interesting, that it synergizes this ability. Everything that we are doing is informational deployment. I mean, we take in raw materials and we excrete manufactured objects, which are essentially ideas. We take in air and we expel words. Everything we do is about stamping higher orders of information on unorganized lower forms of raw material. And it's moving out of us, moving out of our bodies, this technical engine that we have created of computers and scientific institutions and rapacious government agencies and commercial concerns. It has a life of its own. It's defining what humanity will be for itself. It's a war about language, about, Joseph Goebbels was the great 20th century thinker who understood this more clearly than anyone else and set the tone, set the rules of the game, so that the deconditioning effect of the drugs, the introduction to alien modalities, the glossolalia, the accessing of the vision state, all of these things have to do with information and the life of its own that it is taking on. And we are like the privileged observers of this. It's as though, no less a psychedelic voyager, researcher, and bon vivant than William Burroughs said, English is a virus from outer space. And that's what I've been trying to say, and now I'm finished. Yeah.
See, the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about the creative power of sound or language, for me, is the experience that I had with the holophonic sound, where you had a sense, that qualities in other senses are created through sound.
Right.
And I wonder what would happen if you record this holophonically, and then people listen to that.
Now that's an idea. That's a very interesting idea.
I heard a lot of things, where it transmits qualities of emotions, people in unusual states and so on. But there I came as close as I've ever been to understanding that there's something special about the creative power of sound.
Of sound, yes, I think
See, I
so.
always saw it as a metaphor, that what science has discovered about vibrations, and that sort of when they talk about sound, they really mean vibrations, so not sound literally.
Well, they talk too much about sound, I think, and not enough about language. Most people, when they think about the creative power of sound, they think about the mantric approach, syllables, sustained tones. And what I'm more interested in is the self-transforming power of grammar, that there is really something going on there.
Yeah, but it's just the next stage.
Right. Well, these things, it's all gradations. This is all of a piece somehow, and how the visual cortex and the voice relate to each other is not well understood. One thing I want to mention, I just thought of it, but because there may be experimentalists in the room. This was appeared 3 months ago in Scientific American, and to me, it just seems astonishing. It is that anyone who can sustain 100 hertz hum, that's 100 cycle per second hum, can look at an electric fan, and if you can sustain this 100 cycle hum, you can slow the fan down, make it appear to stop, make it go backwards. You can do this to a phonograph record, you can do it to a spinning wheel. This is not stoned. This is simply using the voice. Well, it sounds like pure magic. How can such a thing happen? The explanation of the Scientific American was that actually the resonant voice cavity is imparting vibration to the eyeballs, and that it's actually this subtle vibration is breaking up the photon input, and you're actually getting a stroboscopic effect. Well, the guy who wrote the article said that he had no training in music and was tone deaf. So to test the theory that it was vibration of the eyes, he built a little machine where he strapped his chin onto a box, and by manipulating a dial could make the box vibrate and impart the vibration to his chin. So then, and he also used, you can make TV pictures appear to roll, or you can fix rolling without getting out of your chair by doing it. And he attached his chin to the box and ran it up to 100 hertz, and lo and behold, this effect was happening. Well, imagine an Amazonian shaman being able to approach a waterfall or something like that and make the water stop or flow uphill, things like this, with no technology except the human voice. How many things are there like that, you know? How many human abilities are there that we are just unaware of or have masked? And what could you do with it? I mean, I suggest stopping a waterfall, because I've just given it 5 seconds thought. But what if you'd given a millennium of thought to social institutions and little tricks and party games that could be used if you could stop time with your voice? And we bring orthodox physics to bear and say, well, acoustical vibration, stroboscopic effect, etc., blah, blah. But what is experientially happening is here's a man who uses sound to control the speed of passing time. If that's not a magical ability, what is? And yet it's all nuts and bolts. And he hasn't even taken his first hit of ayahuasca. This is just on the natch, right? So what happens when you add in, you know, the exotic psychodynamics of these compounds?
Well, that's a lot. What two things come to mind. One is I understand that Hitler's generals would go into him, you know, and they're going to talk him out of this next invasion because he's totally off the wall. And they come out glassy-eyed and convinced they're going to go invade some more.
Well, he'd probably been chatting with Joseph Goebbels before they walked in.
And the other thing is Milton Erickson, who just with his voice does all sorts of things to people that are, you know, totally.
He can't
totally
even speak
amazing.
their language. He can do it to people that he doesn't understand them, and they don't understand him.
Totally with sound, and he moved his head around in real unusual ways, even after he stopped talking. You know, who knows what that does?
Ayahuasqueros are interesting because when you meet a few of them, they all have a bunch of mannerisms which have to do with their voice and a certain sound that they make. Who the only honky I've ever met who came even close to this was Ralph Metzner. Has a curious speech habit, which is this, it's a kind of a purr at the back of your throat. But these ayahuasqueros do it very noticeably, and when they're listening to you, you hear them purring, and they have very smooth, liquid, invasive voices. And of course, ayahuasca, the way in which it's taken, it's very interesting. There's no drumming. I've never seen a musical instrument at an ayahuasca session. Everything is voice, voice, voice. And that's what they're into. Don Fidel is a good example. Many of you have probably heard his tape. But there are many such practitioners. They also, in the curing process, use very sharp sounds. And in fact, when you talk to Don Fidel, he has a very animated style that is not the macho Spanish style at all. His speech is punctuated with all these aspirations, sharp sounds. And he obviously has a relationship to sound that's very different than we do. We can play it sometime or in an intermission sometime. And it's wonderful to trip to. It's very good. So that's how the boar ate the cabbage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.